When it comes to trilogies, the good ones at least, their final part is where the audience gets to see the protagonist put the lessons that they've learned in the previous two stories into action. The culmination of the trilogy's theme lived out in personal maturity. It's when the main character rises to the occasion, choosing the right path without doubt or question. We call this character growth, a quality of being that was either missing or in an embryonic state when the story began, but now has been built, thus making them worthy of being a heroic example to make our own personal goal for maturity in that manner. In this trilogy of Davidic stories from 1 Samuel chapter 24 to 26, nestled within the greater story of the book of Samuel, we've witnessed parts 1 and 2. In chapter 24, while he and his men had been on the run from Saul, David found himself in a place to assassinate the king. A surprise attack, much like the one that Saul had once tried to do to David by pinning him to the wall with his ceremonial spear. But a metaphorical stone struck David's heart, causing him to realize that it wasn't his place to assassinate the Lord's anointed. There was a better way, one of humility. Then in chapter 25, we get to part 2. Here, David found himself treated like less than nothing by the foolish man Nabal. Anger welled up in David, and he commanded over half of his army to rise up and slay every male of Nabal's house. The fool wasn't the Lord's anointed, so it seemed like revenge was on the table. Revenge that would have led to slaughter because most of the partygoers in Nabal's house would have been drunk by the time the army met them. But it was humility in the form of the wise Abigail which reminded David that vengeance was the Lord's domain. And David was only to fight God's battles, while God fought for his. Holy vengeance performed in God's perfect timing. Now, as we turn the page to 1 Samuel chapter 26, we get to see David in a place of mature humility, trust in God's timing for vengeance against those who stand as David's enemy, as the people of Ziph once again stir up Saul to hunt his kingly successor. 1 Samuel chapter 26, verses 1 to 5. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hakilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon?" So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hakilah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshimon. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay, with Abner the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was laying within the encampment, while the army encamped around him. It almost feels like déjà vu. People from the southern part of Judah go up to Saul into his home base of Gibeah to tattle on David and his whereabouts. Sure, the exact location of the fugitive is a little different, but he's still near the place of desolation. Saul then takes 3,000 of his chosen warriors to track down David, right to the very hill which the Ziphites said David would be. But all that Saul found was a nice place to set up camp, which is why he and the army put up their tents so that they could search out in the larger area later. Right at that moment it was late, so their hunt could wait until after a good night's sleep. The reason why David's men hadn't been on that hill is because his spies had done their job well. He knew Saul was coming, and David sent his troops to another nearby location. But David and a couple of his men went near Saul's camp in order to do some more spying. And maybe something else. Only the something else was different depending on whose mind you were to read. 1 Samuel chapter 26, verses 6 to 12. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother, Abishai the son of Zeruiah, "Who will go down with me into the camp to Saul?" And Abishai said, "I will go down with you." So David and Abishai went to the army by night. And there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then said Abishai to David, "God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please, let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice." But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" And David said, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go." So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. We see David and 2 of his men creep near the hill on which Saul's camp rests. One is Ahimelech the Hittite, to be differentiated from Ahimelech the high priest, and the other is David's nephew Abishai, the son of David's sister Zeruiah. Abishai is also Joab's brother. The reason for this naming is because Joab is the commander of David's army, thus Abishai would be considered lesser, and would be more known as Joab's brother than simply as Abishai. Any younger siblings feel that pain? And this would be even though Abishai is well known as a mighty warrior himself, listed among David's elite soldiers, along with both of his brothers. But that's for another time. For now, it's enough to say that Abishai, the elite warrior of David's men, was the one to speak up, saying that he'd be the one to infiltrate the camp along with David. The pair wound their way through a completely sleeping camp. It probably surprised them how easy it was to slip past the sleeping guards and watchmen. Without finding a single wakened soldier, they made it to Saul's tent. There was Saul and Abner, the commander of Saul's army. Saul had his ceremonial spear stuck into the ground near his head along with a water jug. The jug would be incredibly important in this desert land. Saul's own life is wrapped up in his ability to have water. Without it, a man in this wilderness would be as good as dead. And the spear was likely the very same one that Saul had chucked at David multiple times, events which began this season of David as a fugitive. It was also likely the symbol of Saul's kingship, something which he took up as a royal scepter. Thus there was Saul laying with his life and his kingship resting by his head. All that David needed to do to take both was kill Saul. That's what Abishai sees. This is the moment we've been waiting for, Uncle David. Maybe in the cave it wasn't God's timing, but this has to be it, right? Let me do the honors if you still have reservations of being the one to kill the Lord's anointed. I'll get it done in one swift thrust of his own spear. I can't help but wonder if the story of Jael from the time of the judges bounced around Abishai's head. She had lulled to sleep the general of an army set against God's people. And while he slept, she killed him, pinned him to the ground with a tent peg. One swift stroke and one dead enemy of God. It's exactly what Abishai saw as his moment to be remembered in history. But in humble wisdom, David speaks against this action by reminding Abishai and us of the lessons he'd learned in the last two stories. It's not just that David shouldn't kill the Lord's anointed, because anyone who attempts to do so will sin. Because the one who does such a thing is taking the work of God from God's own hand. It's treason against God's will, and a lack of trust in his promise. God's will performed in his timing is exactly what David speaks of in verse 10. The lesson he had learned while dealing with the fool. Vengeance against God's people will be worked by God himself, whether directly or through a human agent, but never through the one wronged. It is not our place to find the quick and easy answer when God has something better for us. David knows it will be God's timing when Saul dies. It might be one day soon through some miraculous manner like how Nabal died. It might be when Saul reaches old age. Or it might be one day in battle when God allows his enemy to slay Saul. But no matter when it is, David must allow God to take the vengeance for him. How could he deny that? God had already proven this fact through Nabal. We need to ask when we think that God's not acting quickly enough. Are we just wanting to get our own way right now, instead of allowing God to take control of the situation? For some things, this might be the moment. But we must be closely aligned with God's ways before we can feel confident to make that claim. David was a man greatly aligned with the heart of God, and thus he knew that seeking vengeance right now was nothing more than personal vengeance, instead of the will of God. So he left Saul alive. Instead, David commands Abishai to take the symbols of Saul's life and kingship, the water jug and the spear, as proof of how easily David could have taken both. David means to have another conversation performed in humility and wisdom. The last half of verse 12 explains to us how David and Abishai could wind their way to the center of a camp full of Saul's best men, have a full-blown conversation while standing right by Saul and the commander of his army, and get back out with Saul's personal water jug and his ceremonial spear. God would make a deep sleep come upon the whole camp. Not one soldier remained awake. This whole thing was God's subtle protection for David, so that the man could reach a place to exercise his humble wisdom and trust in God's timing. God provided the chance in his own miraculous way, so that David could take the symbols of Saul's life and kingship, just as God would do miraculously with the real thing in his own timing. It was all to prove the character growth of David's humble trust in God's work and timing, a test passed because of humble trust in God. And so that David wasn't the only one to see this humble trust, he called out to wake Saul's army with the truth of God's work among them. 1 Samuel chapter 26, verses 13 to 16. Then David went over to the other side and stood far off on the top of the hill, with a great space between them. And David called out to the army and to Abner the son of Ner, saying, "Will you not answer, Abner?" Then Abner answered, "Who are you who calls to the king?" And David said to Abner, "Are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is, and the jug of water that was at his head." In the dark stillness of night, David went a safe distance away to call out to Abner and the army he commanded. And when Abner responded, David rebuked them for failing in their job of protecting the Lord's anointed. "How could you have failed in your one job, Abner? It's not just the king that you protect, but the Lord's anointed. Realize the value of the life that you guard." David then explains that because of this lack of security, one passed through the camp with intent to destroy Saul. Yeah, it was Abishai. But part of the point here is that it was this voice calling out in the darkness of night that protected Saul from that deadly end. David himself, the person whom so many were saying wanted to slay Saul, was the one who protected the king. It was David, because of the Lord, who protected Saul's life from that fate. David continues his words to Abner, but the Hebrew pronouns show us that David is now including the whole army, because the yous switched to the plural. You all deserve to die. Not a single one of the chosen warriors truly guarded their king's life, a failure that would so often lead to death. They had all failed at that job. And for proof, plus a symbol of how easily David could have taken both Saul's life and kingship, he tells Abner to look where the jug and spear had lay. I'm sure at this moment Abner's stomach fell. Realization of how closely he came to his king's life being taken. But just then Saul comes to realize that it is indeed David who speaks to him. And it sounds very much like a repeat of chapter 24. 1 Samuel chapter 26, verses 17 to 25. Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And David said, "It is my voice, my lord, O king." And he said, "Why then does my lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, Go serve other gods. Now therefore let not my blood fall on the earth away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your sight this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly, and have made a great mistake." And David answered and said, "Here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." Then Saul said to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them." So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. So Saul realizes that the voice belongs to David. It's not the first time that David is called out to him from a vulnerable position. And notice that again, Saul calls him David, my son. Saul's given him a call to another husband, but David is still referred to as Saul's son. He can't help but speak to the fact that David will succeed him as king in Israel. But while David does continue to speak in the role of a servant, calling Saul my king and Lord and calling himself servant, notice that David doesn't refer to Saul as his father, like he did at the cave. David knows that his ascent to the throne will have nothing to do with being Saul's son-in-law. Rather, it is by the will and work of God alone. In verse 18, David continues to ask Saul why he chases after him. "What evil have I done?" David says that if there were some sin that had caused God to make Saul come after him, then a sacrifice will atone for it. David's willing to repent if some sin has accidentally occurred between them. But if this whole thing is because some people have started all up again, David calls a curse down on them. But notice why David calls down the curse in verse 19. It's not a curse because they've made his life miserable, or because they've caused animosity between fellow Israelites. No, it's because such people have kept David from being able to worship God properly at his tabernacle. Their continued stirring up of strife has made David unable to freely enter the place God has chosen to worship him. As a fugitive, it's as if those people who stir up this whole thing are saying to him, "Get out and stay out. You have nothing to do with the people of God. You might as well go and worship the false gods of the surrounding nations. Go live and worship their gods." David's heart is broken. Not because he's been forced to camp out in the desert wastes, not because the throne has been kept from him, but because proper worship of his God has been kept from him. Saul's eyes have been kept on keeping his throne. The people of Ziph and those like them desired to look good in the eye of their earthly king. But David's vision is directed toward his God. There's a reason why God has chosen him to be king. I can't help but ask, if we were in a similar situation, would our heart crave after God so much, instead of longing after something else? Personal desires, comfort, our rightful place in life? Do we heed the lessons meant for our growth of character? Learn from them in humility, wisdom, and trust in God's perfect timing, whatever lessons they may be. David had learned some of it at least, and continued to try to remind Saul of that truth as well. In verse 20, David again calls himself nothing but a flea that the king chases after. David also compares his hunt to chasing after a partridge. His metaphor is kind of funny when you consider the fact that the Hebrew word for partridge comes from the word for calling out, since David is currently calling out from a hidden location, and they have been chasing after him, beating every bush, which is just how they hunted these birds. It's a bit of wordplay and the reminder of following God's will. And again, it seems that the reminder strikes Saul to the heart. In front of his entire army, Saul admits that he is the one who has sinned between the two of them. Saul tells David that he can return, possibly saying, "Come back to the tabernacle so that you can worship God." And Saul promises that he will no longer hunt after David, because his life was precious in David's eyes this night. Saul even continues by saying that he had acted foolishly. This links us back to the fool, Nabal, from the last chapter. The king had made a great mistake, and now he is dropping the whole thing. We might scoff at this repeated repentance because Saul has basically said the same thing in chapter 24. And here we are again in the same situation. But this time there is some truth to Saul's promise of not chasing after David anymore, because this is the last recorded interaction between the two of them. Hearing this repentance, David tells the king to send one of his younger soldiers over to get the spear back. David's not here to steal the kingship from Saul. It still belongs to him until God sees fit to fully take it away. The time when God rewards David for his righteousness and faithfulness in his act of trusting God for his perfect timing. Saul ends this interaction by blessing his son David for his deeds. Indeed, David will do many great things in the name of God. And thus the two leave, each to their own direction, never to see each other alive again. It was humility and trust in God that allowed the character growth of David for this moment. Provisions and guidance during past events led David to this moment of full and complete trust in God. It's when we allow the lessons of the past to teach us that we can grow into the people God has made us to be. When the truth of God has repeatedly built into us His ways, that is when we can stand as examples of heroic maturity and humble trust. We might want many things, have plans for our lives and understandings for our future, but they are nothing more than dreams, delusions of grandeur, if we don't humbly align our hearts with the work and timing of God. We have to allow Him to provide instead of snatching it for ourselves. I know that this is a difficult thing to do when we live in a culture that tells us to take what we feel like we deserve. But the truth is that an immature grasp at what we want, even if they're good things, is still sin. A lack of faith in the fact that God can provide. Sure, God uses our desires and our actions to build our faith, but let's not outpace His timing. When we look to the end of the story, will we find miserable failures who grasped at what was out of reach at the moment? Or will we find mature people whose character grew at God's rate? Because I know that I certainly would rather be an example for others to follow than be a foolish example of what not to do.